The podcast is Going to the Conspiracy, featuring Auckland's Josh Addison and Bucharest's Dr. Matthew R. X. Dentith.
Guten Abend, you're listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I'm Josh Edison, as usual in Auckland, New Zealand, and somewhere around here is Dr. Matthew Dentith, who is in Bucharest in Romania in his bedroom, I believe.
It's true. I am recording from the depths of my citadel in Bucharest, which is to say I'm recording from just outside the palatal Czech Bank, where it's snowing, and I don't use these words lightly, like crazy.
Whereas yesterday it was ridiculously humid and gross and hot, and the air conditioning in the building where I work broke down, and so we sat there all day and sweated. And it was not a lot of fun.
You bourgeois people with your air conditioning and your buildings.
Yes.
Your buildings, I mean, really, what kind of bourgeois fantasy world do you live in where you work in a building?
Well, I mean, it was a building designed to have air conditioning, which meant it doesn't have opening windows or anything, on the assumption that it will always be climate controlled inside, and then suddenly it wasn't, and then things went horribly, horribly wrong.
Yes,
But
this
enough
is why
about
when you
us,
build
you
a
and me
building,
and
maybe you should
climate.
have a plan B, i.e. a window which can open on every floor just in case.
Just in case of suicidal tendencies.
No, in case it gets really, really hot.
Right. I suppose your idea makes more sense, yes. Anyway, hello.
That just got dark.
It really did. Let's brighten the mood by begging for money. How about that?
Indeed. So I would like to point out to our loyal listeners that we pay hosting fees for this podcast, and having been soliciting funds from you now for almost 2 years, this year, because last year's hosting was funded by our glorious patron. Patron? And now I can't even make the word patron sound natural or sincere. Our patron, Drew. But this year we used the funds we've collected for the last 2 years to pay for the hosting. Well, I say we almost paid for the hosting because after 2 years of begging you week in, week out to send us $1 a week, $1 a month, $1 a fortnight to fund us in our endeavors, it turns out that after 2 years of collecting, we almost had enough money to pay for 1 year's worth of hosting. So we just like to remind people who listen to the podcast regularly and have thought, yeah, maybe we'll chuck them a couple of bucks a week or a month their way. Why not do that? Why not give us the cost of a cup of coffee over the course of a month to help us pay for our hosting fees so this podcast doesn't cost us money to produce for your enjoyment? Joshua, do you have any begging words you want to add to my plaintive cry for please fund us, please fund us?
Well, I would just like to say, obviously, thank you very, very much to the people who have given us money, and we appreciate it greatly.
The good cop
Yes.
The good cop routine. Excellent.
Yes, so we appreciate very much the people who have given us money. Can you do that some more, please? I think basically covers it.
Although that does now make it sound as if we're telling existing patrons you must up your pledges. What we really want are more patrons, more people to share
both
their...
even.
Well, yes. Well, yes. I mean, if existing patrons want to double, quadruple, or just give us $1,000 a month, we're not going to say no. At the same time, we're not going to tell new patrons that they should be giving us $1,000 a month as well.
No,
we don't have those
briefcases full of unmarked currency will be appreciated, yes.
Oh, yes, yes. Donate as many briefcases to the cause as you possibly can. And the more overflowing with cash, the happier we will be.
Right, I think we've expended our begging shamelessly quota for the week, so maybe we should get on with
now
things.
provide them with content.
Yes, exactly. Give them what they're paying for. So we might as well, indeed. We might as well, I guess, go straight into the news then.
Indeedy.
Breaking conspiracy theories in the news.
Right, so In local news, in local sports news, which is the best kind of news,
And
really,
as
I'm
you
sure you'd
know,
agree.
we are sports people.
We
We
do
know all about the
sports all the
sports
time.
ball. We're always competing in sporting endeavors. I had a sport this morning.
Yeah, I did a sport just before we started recording. It was brilliant. But yes, we talked a little while ago about a case recently where the All Blacks, the New Zealand's national
National
rugby
rugby
team,
team, basically. Yeah.
and not some sort of weird racist slur. Who was it? Was it Will I Am? Someone came to New Zealand. An African American celebrity came to New Zealand, and the first thing he saw upon getting off a plane was a sign that said, "All Blacks use this product." And he was like, "You what?" Until someone said, "No, it's the All Blacks. So they're a sports team. It's not racist."
Although it doesn't help that we have another national sports team called the All Whites.
Yes, no, that's the soccer team, named after their uniforms. I should be very clear. But yes, no, there was a case a little while ago where they found a bug in their room, in their hotel room in Sydney, and it looked like not so much the work of a rival team trying to get an advantage over them, but more likely, some sort of a betting syndicate trying to get some inside information to get better odds or place better bets or something like that. But there's been an arrest, I understand.
Yes, of a member of the All Blacks' own security team.
Mm. Yes, it's a little bit murky. I like reading the reports. It sounds like it's one of those weird things where newspapers here aren't allowed to talk about some details, but other countries are, or something. I've seen a lot of sort of Australian sources have reported that blah blah blah, which seem to be like as though they weren't allowed to say it themselves or something. But
Yes, because you're allowed to report what other newspapers have
mm,
reported, even if you can't report it directly yourself. So it's a neat trick to get around particular injunctions by going, well, we can't say this, but it has been reported elsewhere that.
mm. And one of the things that's come up a couple of times is an interview with one of these security type people, who makes reference to the idea that this guy planted the bug himself so that he could then be the one to come in and say and find it and be the hero who found the bug in the All Blacks room. And sort of in the context of the interview, the guy sort of says that that's a kind of a story you hear and it's always nonsense, but in this case it seems like it might not be. So that's at least one rumor about how it all happened. But I think the most important point about the entire affair is that the papers here are calling it Spygate, which is like surely that
Yes,
is the
Spygate.
weakest gate. They might as well just call it Thing Gate or just generic Scandal Gate. I'm sickened, quite frankly, Matthew. Sickened.
I am sickened too, although there's one other interesting point, which is that the New Zealand Rugby League is going, oh, we find this finding to be rather perplexing because we rather trust this individual and think it's very unlikely he would have done this particular thing. And the Australian Rugby League is going, well, that just shows that we weren't involved. So both sides are going, oh, there's something suspicious about this finding. And that the Australian Rugby League are kind of implying that the New Zealand team deliberately set up a media event on the day of the game. And the New Zealand side is going, this finding's a bit weird. We don't necessarily think this is the full story. So I think
should
it's probably
say,
going to be a scandal, a Spygate that will continue to open and close as gates want to do.
I should say, I'm pretty sure it's the rugby union. Rugby league is different from rugby union. I don't know what the difference is, but it's very, very
I
important.
I think one has padded crotches and the other one has spikes.
It's different numbers of players, and I don't even know. I don't care. Let's move on to something else. Now, there's been this New York Times article that's been going around, and everyone's been talking about it. So I guess we should talk about it. I'm referring,
We
of course,
should,
to the one
because
about Trump
President
and
Trump's
leaks and what have you.
administration
Hmm.
appears to be leaking like the most leaky sieve ever designed by the Leaky Sieve Corporation of Leaky Sylvania.
And that's leaky.
Yeah, that's very leaky. So yes, there's a New York Times article which basically uses a whole bunch of unnamed sources within the Trump administration to explain why the PR surrounding President Trump's first 2 weeks in office have been not just underwhelming, but actually proactively bad, suggesting either that there are people within the administration who don't like the new president and his advisory team, and are thus doing their best to embarrass Trump in the hope that something will come out of it like an impeachment. Or people within the administration are going, look, the only way to curb President Trump's ways, which is to get very bored very quickly, want to watch TV all afternoon rather than read executive orders that he's signing, is to embarrass him in the national media to thus make him up his game. So either you've got a conspiracy within the Trump administration to topple the Trump administration, or you've got a conspiracy within the Trump administration to embarrass the president into acting in a more presidential fashion. So it seems actually quite fascinating because there seems to really be only two options here, both of which are a conspiracy.
Yes, conspiracies as far as the eye can see, really. And then we have another one about this funny Steve Bannon fellow.
Or President Bannon, as he's been dubbed on the internet.
Yes, indeed. Now, you've put up a link here to an interesting article about an interesting book that Steve Bannon is interested in.
What cycles of history tell us about America's next rendezvous with destiny,
Yes,
which
so
is
tell
a
me
very,
about
very
this.
big mouthful. Mouthhill? Mouthhill.
Yes.
I don't even know what a mouthhill. Mouthful.
Yes.
I should point out to listeners, I had my coffee immediately before recording, and I have a feeling it's doing some amount of brain chemistry altering at this particular moment in time. So yeah, so there's this book. We'll just call it The Fourth Turning. It's by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And basically, it's a book which argues that there's a kind of historical force whereby you get a tragedy and then a rebuilding of the country. So it focuses on, say, the Depression at the beginning of the 20th century in America, which was a crisis point, and from that crisis point, the modern welfare state in America was built. And Bannon seems to believe that American history is cyclical in this particular way, and thus what you need is a crisis to then be able to rebuild the world in your particular visage. And so this is worrying for a whole bunch of reasons, because basically what you've got here is Steve Bannon believing a kind of conspiracy theory of history that historians don't talk about because they don't want to talk about the real motive force of the historical process. And also you've got someone who believes this particular thesis, who is a direct advisor to the president of what might be the world's only remaining superpower.
It's interesting. It reminds me of a little article I read a while ago about basically a gun owner in America defending his decision to buy lots and lots of guns, and he dispensed, like, he talked about objections that people had. Why do you need this arsenal? What are you afraid the government's actually going to come after you someday? He kind of discounted the idea that, yes, the government owns drones and an entire army, so what do you think you could do with them no matter how many guns you owned? He seemed to think those arguments were ridiculous, but didn't actually say why. But his main thrust of it was that he sort of thought people who aren't in favor of owning guns believe the Martin Luther King Jr. quote about, is he the one who talked about history bends towards freedom or bends towards something anyway? But the idea that things are getting progressively better and better, but this guy was of the opinion that no, he thinks it's more cyclical and that things have turned to crap before and so they're going to turn to crap again, and he's being prepared for that sort of contingency. Didn't, as far as I'm aware, reference this book, but it did seem like a very, very similar sort of line of thinking.
Yes, and I must admit, I am somewhat sympathetic towards seeing history repeat hypothesis. So one of the things which has come out of the discussion about the American election and what's going on in the UK, and also what seems to be going on with France and Germany with their forthcoming elections, is people talking about, well, we've kind of seen this before, which was the beginning of the 20th century, which led, of course, to the First World War and the Second World War. And so there is something to learning something from the lesson of the past and going, look, we've seen similar circumstances, and thus we can predict what the consequences are. But what Bannon seems to be believing here is that it's not learning lessons from the past and applying those lessons to similar situations now. It is, in fact, a motive force of history that it cycles in a kind of 80-year way process where you get a crisis every 80 years and a rebuilding. And that's the really weird belief here, because that indicates that there's some force operating in the background of which human beings have no control over, which decides the fate of the human race.
Now, I did actually read this article for once, and the conclusion it seemed to come to was that both the authors of the book and Mr. Bannon have kind of got it wrong ultimately, because in the book they initially talk about how there is one of these crises every 80 years or so, but the nature of the crisis is different every time, and yet they are now assuming that the next crisis is going to be exactly like the last one, in opposition to what they'd said not very long before. So the conclusion of the article was that even if it is right, it's kind of wrong anyway.
And yet it's worrying for the sheer fact that this person is in a very high position of authority within the
Yes.
American administration. He appears to have got on the National Security Council by simply getting Donald Trump to sign an executive order the president had never actually read.
Yes, oh well, he's a wacky fellow. You know who else is a wacky fellow, Matthew?
Is it Vladimir Putin?
It actually is Vladimir Putin. It's normally Hitler, but this time it's Putin. So he's been at it again, has he? More him and his poisoning of anti Putin people. What do you call them? Dissidents? Is dissident the word? What's the word I'm thinking of, Matthew? Dissident. There we go.
Yeah,
right.
You said it the first time. I didn't really need to interject.
Right. Well, after that crafty and linguistically masterful introduction, please tell us the story, Matthew.
Now, see, I think you deliberately do this because you know I mangle every single Russian name. So you go, what's he going to do with this one? So basically, a pro-democracy activist who belonged to the group Open Russia by the name of Vladimir Kara-Murza has been taken to an intensive care unit in Moscow after an attack which has all the hallmarks of when he was poisoned back in 2015.
Right, so this individual himself had even been poisoned before. And,
yes,
it didn't
his
take
second
that time.
poisoning. Yes, it's his second poisoning. And he appears to have had an attack which is very similar, which kind of fits into a narrative that Putin kind of likes to poison people who don't support his regime.
Do we know how...
And this is a person that Donald Trump seems to be quite keen to be very good friends with and has defended by saying, well, yes, Putin might be a killer, but, America's filled with killers as well.
Do we know the details of this one, like how it was done, like the Litvinenko case with the poisoned tea and what have you? Do we have any sort of a trail like that, or is it just
not as of yet? So
effects?
all we've got is that he was poisoned in 2015. So he suffered a medical emergency, went into a hospital. The physicians who treated him went, this actually looks like poisoning. They then treated him and he was released. It was suspicious at the time because he was engaged in anti-Putin demonstrations and suddenly was poisoned. And he's been once again involved in anti-Putin demonstrations in Russia and suddenly went to hospital with the same symptoms again, which is making people think he's been poisoned for a second time. Maybe the first time was a warning shot. Maybe this time it was meant to be the killer. Or maybe just another warning. Maybe Putin's gone, let's not kill people with poison. Let's just make them feel extreme discomfort.
But maybe he just really, really likes poisoning, and he's worked out that by doing it this way, he gets to poison the same person over and over again, and instead of just fatally poisoning them the once. Maybe he's just
he's going to build up a resistance if he keeps on poisoning the same people
just have to poison
again and
them
again
more
and again.
with different, new and exciting poisons.
So Vladimir, the experimental poisoner of Russia, not actually trying to kill people, just wants to see what poisons do.
Yep. I'll be feeding a bite of everything I eat to the children first from now on, I think.
I just always assumed you did. I thought that was why you had children, because you're afraid of being poisoned.
No, they're mostly for backup organs, but
What
Now
do you even need backup organs for? You don't do anything to ruin your existing organs. You don't drink, you don't smoke. I mean, really, you're not damaging your organs
yeah,
at the
but
stage. You don't need that many children. Give me one of your children
I lead
so
a
I can use them for
sedentary
my replacement.
lifestyle. I eat too much crappy food, and I don't do any exercise. It's
Well, see,
insurance.
I do the exercise, but the drinking probably is ruining my liver. I
Mm,
really do need either Jack or Lucas's liver, and probably actually quite soon.
mm. Although livers are the funny ones, aren't they? Where you can actually chop a bit off someone else's and like grow a new liver. Isn't that how they work?
They do regenerate a lot more easily than most other organs in the
Mm.
body, yes.
Well, there
And
we
I think
go.
they are easier to transplant than most other organs in the body as well.
Well, there you go. Welcome to the podcaster's guide to organ transplantation. I'm
Remember,
Josh
I am
Edison.
a doctor.
He is. He actually is a doctor, just not that kind. Now this is quite exciting. Actually, we got another email. That's like the second
We
email
did, I
in two
know.
months. I think this is a
I
record for
know
us.
it
Yeah.
almost justifies having an email address set up in
Mm.
Gmail. I mean, all that effort I went through, especially since you have to associate phone numbers with these things now. So you have to change your password. You have to go, oh, I'm in Romania, and the number associated with that email address is actually in Auckland. Now I have to call a support line to explain why I can't access my phone. But anyway,
Mm.
we got an email, and it's
Yes.
about the John Locke conspiracy.
Yes. Now I did finally watch the last episode of Sherlock. I didn't hate it. Like it was silly. It didn't really make a lot of sense, but I was expecting Sherlock Holmes to actually reach out of the screen and punch me in the face from what people had been saying about it.
No, so you didn't actually see that you obviously saw an edited version of that episode then, because that definitely happened to me.
Ah, okay. But at any rate, we're not talking about the merits of the finale as such, other than the fact that the finale did not end with Holmes and Watson hooking up, which, according to some people, the proponents of the John Locke theory, this is that shipping business, isn't it, Matthew? I'm never quite sure what I stand on that. Um, but yes, so
You don't ship any characters in any shows that you watch.
I'm no shipper, me.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I have to say, I'm not against shipping, but there are some suspicious forms of shipping in fandom. Supernatural, in particular, people like to ship the two main characters of that show, and shipping the two main characters of that show is awkward because the result is, of course, incest.
yes. But at any rate, so there are
Oh,
people.
for people who
Oh,
don't know what shipping
oh,
is,
yes, that might be an idea. Yes, yes.
shipping is where you take two characters from a show which have no established romantic relationship, and then you produce fan fiction or fan theories about how they're actually deeply in love with one another. So the John Locke shipping thesis is that Watson and Holmes are indeed deeply in love, and the final episode was meant to show that they actually become a couple, and it didn't. Ipso facto, the conspiracy.
Yes, so the idea seems to be that if you watch all of the episodes, there are these actual clues all the way through it showing that Holmes and Watson are going to end up together, which proves that that's what's going to happen in the final episode. And the fact that that didn't happen in what is for now the final episode is just taken as proof that there's going to be another episode where it does happen. And apparently, according to our correspondent, it's become not unlike the sort of doomsday prophets where they insist it's going to happen on this date and then it doesn't. It's like, okay, yes, no, we're right. It wasn't that date. It's the next date. It's going to be next week. No, next week. No, next week. But it still hasn't
Yes,
happened.
initially it was January 29th was when the final was going to be shown. Now apparently it's March 8th. And so this does indicate that the final episode that the John Locke conspiracy theorists, and they're quite happy to call themselves conspiracy theorists in this particular matter, they believe the episode has already been shot. So it's in the can, it's just waiting for a broadcast date.
Yes, it's an interesting wee theory. I mean, I went and looked on a couple of sites just to see the sorts of evidence that they put forward as to the existence of this conspiracy, and surprise, surprise, it was not very strong. A lot of sort of working backwards from a conclusion sort of thing. I think having decided that this was the case, they then look through and say, aha, well, assuming that it is the case, then this could mean that, and so on. And it does cause them to ignore large parts of large bits of episodes where they pointedly made the joke that people think, Holmes and Watson act like a married couple, and people assume they are, but in fact they're not. And indeed, Watson explicitly saying, I'm not gay, on more than one occasion, although Holmes's sexuality has always been a little more ambiguous.
Yes, it does make me think that this seems like it's a plot cribbed from an unwritten Dan Brown novel. The idea that Robert Langdon breaks his leg one weekend and is stuck at home watching PBS, watches all of the series of Sherlock, and then goes, oh my God, I'm a symbologist. I can see the signs and symbols encoded in this TV show. I must unravel the mystery of the Sherlock canon. Because yes, it's very much the idea that there's an encoded message in the shows filled with a whole bunch of gay symbology, and from that we can infer a particular conclusion or thesis. And as that conclusion or thesis has not been directly stated by the end of the text, ipso facto that means there is going to be more text. And given that both Moffat and Gatiss, the creators and co-writers of Sherlock, have said it's very unlikely there'll be another series, just for the sheer fact that both Martin Freeman and Benedict Cumberbatch are very busy with their film careers and TV careers at the moment. And they're going, well, it has to have an ending, and the ending wasn't in that terrible final episode. That means there's another episode that's been shot. When's it going to be broadcast? As opposed to the other hypothesis, which is that Stephen Moffat hates fandom, likes to tease fandom, and if there was a secret fourth episode of the fourth series of Sherlock, he would be keeping it from the fans just to spite them forever.
Well, yes, I have to say they do seem to be a little bit at war with their own fans in the past. I mean, I've read interviews with, I can't remember, it was with either Moffat or Gatiss, I can't remember which one it was. And this was back around sort of after, I think around the end of season 2, when people were starting to complain about it. And he at the time said that he's maintained all the way through that Sherlock is a show. I think his words were, it's not a detective show, it's a show about a detective, meaning that it's not about the the wacky cases and the solving it. It's always been about the characters, whereas the fans seem to much prefer the actual the cases and the solving of it. And it seems that even though they know that, because people tend to be fairly vocal about it, all the while they've been sticking to their guns and saying, no, this is a show about the characters of Holmes and Watson, not about the cases that they solve. That just happens to be a thing that they do sometimes. So yes, I don't know. There's an odd relationship going on. The other thing, of course, is that sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum, Sherlock has been accused of queer baiting, which is not a term I was particularly familiar with, but I understand it's where shows are accused of sort of implying a homosexual relationship between characters to get the queer community on board, but it never actually happens. They're just sort of doing it for demographics. Have I got the right end of the stick there?
Yes, basically, you're trying to get a particular section of the fan community who are desperate for any kind of representation by suggesting to them that that representation will occur within your show, but then not wanting to do that because it might, say, piss off other viewers, or you might be scared of a viewer backlash, etc., etc. So you continue to bait the queer fans by appearing to promise them something, but never actually fulfilling it. And yes, I would say there's quite a fair bit of queer baiting that goes on in the work of Stephen Moffat. So outside of the podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, I've been quite critical of Stephen Moffat's run on Doctor Who over the last few years, because I think Moffat is much more interested in grand character dynamics that make little to no plot sense than he is in telling decent stories these days. And that was my issue with the finale of Sherlock. It was a grand high drama about Sherlock Holmes, and it wasn't actually particularly well plotted. And so I was watching it going, the motivation here is pretty thin, and I'm just really hate watching the show at this particular point in time. Really, really hate watching
Fair
it.
enough. Now, Moffat, was he the one who did the Hyde miniseries
He
with
did
James Nesbitt?
indeed.
Yeah, I think Moffat is just a bit shit at endings. I think I remember the Hyde miniseries was really cool right up into the ending where it just ended with a quite sort of with a bit of a whimper. He's written awesome. I think possibly some of the best ever episodes of Doctor Who, and it's in the recent run as standalone bits inside other people's series. But when he's been in charge of them himself, they always seem to collapse a little bit at the end. And frankly, the end. I will say this for that last Sherlock episode, ending on sort of a shot of the two of them running off towards the camera with their coats billowing out behind them, is actually something I have referred to in the past as a total cliche of an ending shot for a show. I almost wondered if he'd been reading my Twitter feed, but I suspect he has not.
Because he hates you in particular.
Well, yes, there we go. You're listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Works of Stephen Moffat. I'm Josh Addison, and that's Dr. Matthew Dentith, and we should probably get on to something else now that I think we've run out of news topics.
Indeed, we should move on to a substantive topic, a very serious topic, about a massacre that no one is talking about.
Let's do that. And we're back. So, the serious incident that we wanted to talk about this week, which many other people have indeed been talking about because it is very serious, is of course the Bowling Green Massacre. Where were you when you first heard about the Bowling Green Massacre, Matthew?
Actually, I was in bed, so I've been suffering from insomnia for the last few weeks, and so I woke up at 5 a.m. in the morning after a broken night's worth of sleep. Realized I wasn't going to be able to get back to sleep, so I checked Twitter, and Twitter was awash with references to the Bowling Green Massacre. Now, I'm aware that Twitter was only reporting on the Bowling Green Massacre well after this massacre had occurred. So, Josh, tell me, what is the Bowling Green Massacre?
Well, reports vary a little bit, to be honest. According to some, the Bowling Green Massacre was a terrorist attack when a combination of Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists mounted an attack on the innocent patrons of a bowling green somewhere in America. Other people claim that the Bowling Green Massacre was the massacre of an actual bowling green, where terrorists came in with like spades and weed killer and murdered the very land itself. Other people still insist that it was a massacre with a bowling green. They came in with their terrorist bulldozers and dump trucks and actually stole and made off with the entire green and then dropped it on the heads of unsuspecting civilians somewhere else. So as you can tell, it's all just a little bit murky.
Yes, I had actually heard that the Bowling Green Massacre refers to a town in America by the name of Bowling Green where a massacre occurred. And that just seems astounding for the sheer fact there's a town called Bowling Green, which to my mind either indicates that bowling was very popular in this town, or Americans use bowling in a word in a word. They use bowling in a word. I'll just finish that sentence. But they also use bowling in a way which differs from the way that the rest of us English speakers use it.
I thought the W word you were hunting there for was going to be world. They use bowling in a world.
In a
Unlike
world
any
where massacres occurred, Bowling Green was where that massacre came about. Now, you might think we're making light of a serious topic here, listeners. Massacres like those which happened at Bowling Green are no laughing matter, or at least they wouldn't be if they'd actually occurred. Because despite some claims to the contrary by members of the Trump administration, there never was a massacre at Bowling Green. So we need to ask, what's going on? Joshua, what's going on?
Well, what is going on? This all came about initially because in an interview on Hardball with Chris Matthews, Kellyanne Conway, who is she just a spokesperson or does she have a greater role these days? I can't keep up. I think
she
Trump's
is
spokesperson.
Part of the advisor team. Yeah.
Is she Trump advisor now? At any rate, you know who she is. She's the one who's been saying mildly silly things on a fairly regular basis in the media.
Like alternative facts.
Yes, she's the one who came up with alternative facts. Now, in an interview...
What we call lies.
she said, and I quote, I bet there was very little coverage, I bet it's brand new information to people, that President Obama had a 6-month ban. She was saying this, by the way, in defense of Trump's so-called Muslim ban. That President Obama had a 6-month ban on the Iraqi refugee program after 2 Iraqis came here to this country, were radicalized, and they were the masterminds behind the Bowling Green Massacre. I mean, most people don't know that because it didn't get covered. And people were like,
You're
hang
right,
on,
it didn't
Bowling
get
Green Massacre? What the hell is she talking about?
Covered. She's quite right. There was no news talk about a massacre at Bowling Green because there was no
As it
massacre at
turned
Bowling
out,
Green.
yes, this
You
entire
can't
thing
report
was-
on something which didn't occur, although it turns out the Trump administration is quite happy to report on events that have never occurred in this particular reality.
Yes, so she sort of became a figure of fun. Well, became more of a figure of fun following this. I was a little bit surprised, actually, upon reading up on this, to find that while what she said wasn't what you would call true, there was a tiny amount of truth to it, because there is a place in Kentucky called Bowling Green, and in 2011 there was an incident involving Iraqi immigrants. And it did cause Obama to do something about immigration. But there was no ban and there was no massacre. So things get a little bit murky, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that this event in Kentucky in 2011, where 2 Iraqi immigrants were convicted for, among other things, conspiracy to kill US nationals abroad, conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction against US nationals abroad, distributing information on the manufacture and use of IEDs, attempting to provide material support to terrorists, and conspiracy to transfer, possess, and export Stinger missiles, caused the Obama administration to tighten restrictions on Iraqi refugees and immigrants for 6 months, which included introducing new background checks and re-vetting a bunch of people who'd already been vetted, which slowed down immigration from Iraq for 6 months, but crucially did not ban it. So there were still refugees coming into America from Iraq at that time, just at a slower pace with tighter restrictions. So Kellyanne is correct to say there was an event in Bowling Green, and the event in Bowling Green did cause the Obama administration to engage in an activity. But she's wrong to say that event was a massacre, and she's wrong to say that that massacre justified the existence of a ban, which never occurred.
Yes, she dug herself a little bit deeper by later trying to say, oh, yes, I just misspoke. It was just a slip of the tongue. I should have said the Bowling Green incident or talked about the Bowling Green terrorists, until people unearthed other reports, interviews rather, that she'd given recently, where again she was very clearly talking about an attack in which people lost their lives. Now, the charitable assumption, I suppose, would be that she's just a bit ignorant, that she knew there was something that happened at Bowling Green, and because the entire point of her saying all of this is to try and justify the Trump line that they need to put bans on people coming from these countries, otherwise there'll be some sort of terrorist attack. So in the context of that, and she'd heard about this business in Bowling Green and just got a little bit mixed up in her head and just kind of filled in the details with her own imagination. So she was kind of bullshitting to cover up her own ignorance. The less charitable assumption would be that she knew full well that she was talking nonsense and was deliberately choosing to spin an incident in such a way that it appeared to directly support the Trump administration's program, rather than sort of vaguely tangentially sort of provide an example of something that's a little bit like it. And actually, sorry. So the other thing I meant to say was that she wasn't the only one to have spoken about Bowling Green either. There were a few other Republican figures had mentioned this incident in recent times, so she was obviously, going along with one of their talking points, but the actual, what would we say, substance of her talking was not.
It seems like a fair approximation of the word.
Not that great, yes. So what? I guess, Matthew. A person can what's the word? Contacted, connected. The word connected just fell out of the top of my head for a second there, Matthew. A person
Now,
connected.
use it in a sentence.
A
Use it in a
person
sentence.
connected with the Trump administration, telling what could be considered pork pies. It's not really news anymore, is it? Why are we talking about this still?
Well, I suppose because even though it's not really news anymore, you might argue that it should always be news. So there's one thing to, at a pub or at a cafe, having a conversation with friends, having a point you want to make, and then going, oh, I don't quite have all the evidence to hand, but I can bluff my way through this, and if I don't get caught, that's fine. That's one thing. But when you're part of a team presenting a Muslim ban, and Donald Trump has called it a Muslim ban. Sean Spicer, the White House secretary who does the whole meet the press thing, continues to maintain it's not a Muslim ban, despite the fact that his boss, the president, keeps on referring to it as a Muslim ban in tweets. When you're connected with the administration, there's a kind of expectation that when you talk to the press, you deliver to the press facts. You don't deliver to the press bluffing. You certainly don't make stuff up to fill gaps in your knowledge, because making stuff up to fill gaps in your knowledge to justify some kind of activity, even if you're doing it because you think that you're largely right, it's still the wrong thing to do. You have a duty of care to the public, and that duty of care to the public requires you to be rigorous in what you say and your justifications. So we should care for the sheer fact that it's emblematic of a kind of new style of regime control we're seeing from the Trump administration, which is to bluff, 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 bluster, 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 and make things up to fill the gaps, to justify things which turns out there's little justification for. As we've discovered with people doing statistical analyses, the 7 countries covered by the ban, no member of those countries has committed a terrorist attack in America since 2011. So
and indeed,
they
I
are
don't think
not.
any of them were involved in September 11, weren't they? The September
No,
11
not at
hijackers
all.
were Saudis, Egyptians, and Lebanese, and no 3
People
of
who
those
aren't
countries have been on
affected
the
by the
list.
ban.
Yes.
Also, countries where the Trump family business does business,
Yes.
and the countries affected by the ban, Trump doesn't do any business in, which kind of makes you think that maybe those countries were listed for the sheer fact that it doesn't hurt the Trump empire less than it hurts the American empire. But that's another matter for another time. We can talk about Donald Trump conspiracies to our heart's content on this podcast. So, yeah, there's a worry here that this is a new style of regime. And we shouldn't allow it to be normalized and go, oh, they'll probably get better with time. We need to be calling them out on it now, because if this is the beginning, gods know what the end is going to look like.
I wonder sometimes the value of the sort of fact checking that goes on sort of willy-nilly, because on the one hand, yes, there are so many things coming out, they are wrong, they're provably wrong, they should be proven wrong and thrown back in the faces of the people saying them, and yet when this is done, it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. And certainly with things like I was genuinely surprised when I was researching this to find out that there was actually something that happened in Bowling Green, that it was actually kind of pertinent, because all I'd seen was mockery and humorous memes on the left-wing internet, and it was like that's just seems to be going for the easy thing. I have no alternative, unfortunately. It feels like there should be a better way of working against the Trump administration than simply waiting for them to say something and then coming back with a no, that's not actually true and I can prove it. But strangely enough, being on the other side of the planet and not heavily politically involved, I don't really have any idea what that is.
No, I share your concern here. On one level, it does turn out that she was speaking about something, but she was, on the other hand, completely misrepresenting that thing to justify some other activity that the administration had engaged in. And so, yes, maybe she wasn't quite as stupid as she first appeared, but at the same time, that might arguably make it worse. It's one thing to be stupid and say something which is completely false, but you say it because you're not in control of your faculties in a kind of rational sense. There's another thing to go, I'm not quite sure of my details here, but I'm just going to make the stuff up to justify what the president is doing. That seems like a dangerous precedent for a president
yes.
or a presidential advisor.
Indeed. And speaking of precedent, of course, we have things like good old Pizzagate that we've already talked about, where a quite frankly ludicrous conspiracy theory around the Clinton administration ended up with a man walking into a pizza shop with a gun. And even further back, look at things like, say, Gamergate, where a person coming up with just what was quite frankly a whinging diatribe, a large amount of which I understand was provably false, and yet that resulted in massive hate campaigns and stalking and intimidation and harassment and so on. So, yeah, I mean, there is a definite danger in people with a large platform disseminating information that is less than 100%. How would you say, true?
Yes, facts versus alternative facts. And I mean, this is where we get into the interesting aspect of conspiracy here, because both sides, and let's decide to carve the world into Democrats versus Republicans for ease of discussion.
Sorry,
here.
Matthew, can I get you to tilt your laptop? That's better, because the way you were there right now, your mouth was almost exactly over the corner of my little video thumbnail, and I was starting to look like a speech bubble coming out of your mouth, as though I were somehow your puppet or mouthpiece.
Look, as this podcast has established in the past, I am in fact you doing an impression.
Bugger.
People don't realize how difficult it is to do a video podcast. A discussion between two people, the amount of scripting and requirement of being in the right place at the right time is very, very difficult. When it's a podcast, it's quite easy to cut two audio tracks together, but I have to record one video stream and then put my face mask and makeup on and be able to react in real time to what is a largely improv script. It's very difficult to play this particular role. And that role too. That role. I can't remember where I'm going to put the thing.
To
the role
left,
of the
down left, I think. Down.
That's the whole,
Yep.
The thing and the.
Yes,
and
quite
the
frankly,
shadow,
you
shadow
created a
act,
rod for your own back by going to the video format. Not unlike, perhaps, if I can segue for a second, liberals kind of created, or progressives, or whatever the hell they call themselves these days, created a rod for their own back a little bit with the fake news thing, because I'm pretty sure it was anti-Trump. Like, that was the original use of fake news, wasn't it? It was referring to the alt-right stuff as fake news, and Trump picked that up, and boy, did he run with it. So now anything that contradicts what he says is fake news, yes. And of course, this specific incident of less than authentic news is playing into stuff that they've been coming out with subsequent. This massive list of terror attacks they've produced that the media supposedly...
terrorist attacks that the media has never discussed or has not discussed at a level the president is happy with.
At which point numerous media outlets are saying, actually, here is the large amounts of cover we gave to these various events, and some events that have been do not appear to have actually been terrorist events. There was that stabbing in Australia. I understand. One...
Yes, in a rural Kingsland hostel last year, there was what the Trump administration has called a terrorist attack, where someone stabbed two tourists. It should be pointed out the Australian authorities immediately ruled out terrorism as a motive in their investigation. As far as they're concerned, it's just a humble killing. It was not an act of terror.
And
but the
indeed,
Trump administration has said, no, this was an underreported or unreported act of terror overseas, thus justifying our ban. So they've basically made up a terror event as part of their justification for the Muslim ban.
The mother of one of the victims I was reading just today was writing a letter to the Trump administration saying, "Don't use my child's death as your bloody pawn. It was nothing to do with terrorism, and we resent being dragged into this." So yes, they just keep on pushing, I guess, and I suppose it is incumbent on people to push back.
They've also claimed that the Paris Bataclan attacks, the nice truck killings, the San
that's Nice, the city in France, not the killings which were particularly nice. Those nice truck killings, not the nasty ones. Don't like those.
I had a momentary lapse of reason there. Oh, the nice truck killings. It's such a nice truck killing. The San Bernardino shootings, the Sydney siege, and Germany's Christmas market attacks, the Trump administration have claimed were hardly reported. And frankly, that's just a lie. They were heavily reported in the international press, and they got substantial media coverage in the US. Maybe Donald Trump thinks they should have done more reporting, but there's no way you can claim that those events were underreported by the media.
And of course, then there's the age-old thing of what appear to be what would otherwise be classed as terror attacks in America that are perpetrated by white people, white sort of nationalists or what have you, never get actually referred to as terrorist attacks, to the point where just today I was reading, I can't remember the names at all, but a senator being interviewed, and the interviewer put to him that the largest loss of life in a terrorist attack after 9/11 was the Oklahoma City bombings, which were done by white men, not Muslim terrorists. And he then basically said, come on, yeah, that's one. Name two white terrorists, and to an extent he has a point, because when they're white they don't get called terrorists. And indeed,
yes, it's a nomenclature issue. We don't call white people who enact in acts of terror within the US terrorists, even though what they're doing are acts of terror. Ipso facto, they should be called terrorists. And so you're right. If the Trump administration is really concerned about normalization of events, because one of the justifications the Trump administration has made for putting forward this list of underreported terrorist attacks around the world, thus justifying the Muslim ban, is that President Trump is really very concerned that these events are happening on a day-by-day basis and thus becoming so normal the media won't report on them. Then it seems odd and inconsistent that the Trump administration is not concerned with the actual daily mass shootings that happen in the US that don't get reported upon in any depth in the mainstream media. If he's concerned about underreporting of horrific events, maybe he should focus on events which are underreported and happen all the time, rather than make up claims about terrorist attacks and then claim that widely reported terrorist attacks were not reported at all in the press.
And it's all just a little bit depressing. Well, we seem to have started with light-hearted mockery of a harmless falsehood, and we've ended up with the notion that everything is a lie and we're all doomed.
Yes, I feel as if I'm about to burst into an Alex Jones-style rant about what the Liberals are doing, the Progressives and the Republicans are destroying the world, etc., etc. Which, as people have pointed out online, Alex Jones has been all over false or fictional or non-existent terrorist attacks and terror plots, and never seems to report actual tragedies that occur on a day-by-day basis in America.
Well,
and one of the worries
about anyway.
The worry about the Trump administration is that the Trump administration is at war with the mainstream media and is cozying up and is sympathetic towards news outlets like Alex Jones. And so what we're seeing here is a presidential administration that relies on Breitbart.com, Infowars.com, prisonplanet.com for their information about the world. And that's a worrying precedent because those sites don't report the everyday tragedies. Those sites report the suspicion of a conspiracy by liberals or elites within our society. Now, whether or not those conspiracies occur is a matter for another time, but we're seeing the consequences of moving to an alternative system of news, which arguably doesn't really have a very high success rate in actually reporting things that happen in the everyday world.
We're all doomed. Are we done now?
I think we are.
Very well then.
Shall I play a chime?
I think you should. And there we go. I think we've come to the end of another episode in a suitably cheery and upbeat manner, which means that all that really remains is for me to say that my name is Josh Edison. You can reach me on Twitter with the username monkeyfluids if you really wanted to. You can send us emails. As it turns out, people actually do. What's our email address, Matthew? I'll only cock it up if I say it.
podcastersguide@gmail.com.
I don't think that's true.
podcastersguide@gmail.com.
I'm almost certain that's not true.
I can check.
I'm almost certain it's
right
podcast
now.
Conspiracy. Because Podcaster's Guide was already taken by an actual guide to podcasting, not...
Oh, for the love of God, you are in fact correct. It's podcastconspiracy@gmail.com. So if you just started emailing us with that address I just gave you, scrub that from your memory, erase it with bleach and acid, and send your email to podcastconspiracy@gmail.com. That's podcastconspiracy@gmail.com.
There we go. And Matthew, if people wish to contact you in a more personal fashion, how would they do that?
They can find me on Twitter @Conspiracism, or they can go to my blog, which is episto.org. That's episto.org, episto.org, where you'll find updates on my research, copies of this podcast, and anything else which amuses me at any given point in time.
This podcast is also available on iTunes, where I'm told you should rate us and give us 5 stars and comment and stuff like that. I understand that's a thing people say.
Apparently that is the only way to get your podcast recognized and promoted up through the list. You need 5-star reviews and you need people leaving comments. So if you are using iTunes to listen to this podcast, please just leave us a 5-star review, not a 4-star, a 3-star, a 2-star, or 1-star, only a 5-star review, and then write whatever you like in the comments. Maybe you want to talk about how glorious you think Josh is, or how sexy you think that the pot plant in the background is. Who knows? You can say whatever you like.
Also, this podcast is posted and hosted on podbean.com. You can find it at conspiracism.podbean.com, where you will find a link to the Podbean's patronage system. I'm not quite sure how the whole... Matthew handles the money side of things.
Patreon system as well. So you can give us money through 2 different systems from one site. How magical is that?
So yes, once again, we massively appreciate the patronage people have given us so far, and we'd just like to say it would be really super awesome if other people did that too.
Yeah, it would make you all much better people, and you're already pretty great, so imagine being even better.
Right, well, I think all that remains is for us to go out on a song. Today we've got Blue Fake Friends by K-Sparks.
Sounds like a good choice. Goodbye.
Bye. Right. Oh, shit. Let's get out of here.
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Edison and Matthew R.X. Dentith, and produced by Matthew R.X. Dentith. If you've enjoyed the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, why not contribute to our Patreon or Podbean patron page? And you can contact us on Podcast Conspiracy.
Right. So we're ready to get recording?
Yeah, let's get this podcast started. My bed is oddly warm.
So is my chair now you come to mention it. A little, don't want to say smelly, but smelly too.
Okay, let me just check our level. Ooh, hold on. Seems to be about an hour's worth of material already on the hard disk. Let me just scrub through that to see what that is. Huh.
Those sneaky Trumpverse bastards.
Hey, M2 stole my last bag of coffee.
Ooh, sneaky scamp. Well, I guess they saved us the trouble of doing an episode.
They sure did. Do we hope they do that again next week?
Maybe, I suppose. I don't know.
I hope he brings back my coffee, though. That was my last bag of local coffee.
Well, I guess in that case, hello everyone. Goodbye everyone.
And goodbye from the podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy.
Yeah.
We were almost your host this week.
Yes. Goodbye.
Toodle pip. I hope it was a good episode.
Sneaky little bastards.